Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Contemplative Science Podcast. My name is Jamie, and as always, I'm here with my co-host, Dr. Mark Miller. Mark, how are you, mate?
I'm doing very well, James. Thanks for that.
Yeah, I'm really excited today because we're lucky enough to be welcoming Dr. Jeffrey Schwartz onto the show. Dr. Schwartz is one of the world's leading experts in neuroplasticity, OCD, and the author of many books, including Brain Lock and You Are Not Your Brain. Jeffrey, thanks for being here.
Yeah, hi. Good. Nice being with you.
So, in your book, You Are Not Your Brain, you unsurprisingly claim that we are not our brains, and I want to find out what you actually mean by that.
Right. I mean, even the fact that you say unsurprisingly puts you at odds with the academic establishment
Yeah.
because, because from the academic, from the academic establishment perspective of this era, the title "You Are Not Your Brain" is blasphemous, and I'll use that word advisedly because the scientific establishment has become something of a church, and and that church is believes in what basically is you might call fundamentalist physicalism, and fundamentalist physicalism says that everything about the mind, when fundamentalist physicalism is applied to neuroscience and neuropsychiatry, etc., it says that everything about what we call the mind is actually completely explicable in principle and all caused by physical phenomena. Of course, they do very much believe that it's largely in the brain and central nervous system. So when I say you are not your brain, I am fairly consciously going, at cross currents to that belief. Although I've worked in academia, my whole life, and so what I mean by that, in the most straight ahead way of putting it, is that one particular aspect of what we call the mind is active. And that word active becomes very important because when in physicalism, there really is no real meaning to the word active as it's used in common language. Everything is passive. Everything is caused by physical phenomena. And that's why it's largely determinist and very much doesn't really believe in free will. So when I say that you are not your brain, I'm trying to really make the point that at least one aspect of what we do with our mind can be understood in terms of active free will. And that one thing is choices you make about how you focus your attention. So that when I say you are not your brain, I'm saying that there's more to choices that are made about how one focuses one's attention than is just determined by physiological processes in the brain, nervous system, body, etc.
Yeah, so you've potentially just set us up there for the follow-up when you mentioned attention. Why is that a useful thing to know for meditators?
Oh, well, I mean, I guess, the word meditation, like almost everything else in this culture, has become so debased that you almost have to say, well, okay, let's talk about what that is. But in any traditional understanding of meditation, any traditional understanding of it, meditation is about, in a word, how you focus your attention, choices you make about how to focus your attention. And then, that term mindfulness, which, is a, I like to say pre-Christian, ancient conception it's a word that really was coined by Gautama, approximately 400 to 500 BC, and mindful attention basically is attention that and that's my proxy for meditation. I mean, even in other, in Jewish, Christian, Islamic, I know almost nothing about, but Hindu meditations. I'm sure I know in at least three of those other four that I just mentioned, Jewish, Christian, and Hindu, and definitely in Buddhist, it's about the choices you make about how you attend to, understand, and process what falls into your conscious awareness. I think one basic way of understanding that is I tend to view the brain, nervous system, physiology part of it as quantitatively huge, but basically passive. And by that I mean that your sense organs bring information into conscious awareness and even non-conscious awareness on a certain level. We don't have to talk about that, but definitely into conscious awareness. You open your eyes, there is vision. Sounds occur, they come in your ears. Smell, taste, touch. Okay. What's left from that is that issue of what aspect of that huge amount of sensory input do you attend to, and what is the quality of attention that you put on it. And in a meditative perspective, you're and especially mindfulness, because let's define, sort of give a easy working understanding of what mindfulness means, or an associated term that I use called the wife advocate, which is mindfulness really is, in the most traditional sense. I mean, the term in Buddhist text is sati, S-A-T-I, and then satipatthana is the setting up of mindfulness. And the setting up of mindfulness occurs by essentially taking what you can call a third person, outer, clear-minded observer perspective on what is passing through your conscious awareness. Right. And so I like to say a third person perspective on first person experience. I like a term that Adam Smith coined back in his book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, of 1759, that is the impartial spectator. That's a Western term that's very related to what mindfulness is. Having a clear-minded, impartial observer perspective through which you then can make moral, ethical decisions about whether your responses to it are wholesome or unwholesome. In Buddhist philosophy, unwholesome is largely defined in terms of three classic terms: lobha, dosa, moha, which really are really easy to translate as greed, craving, ill will, hatred, ignorance, delusion. So you're trying to cleanse, to use that word in meditation. The function of it is to cleanse your attentional choices of the overview of greed, hatred, and delusion, ignorance, craving, and etc. And seeing it from an impartial spectator, wise advocate, clear-minded, third-person perspective. So that turns out to take a lot of effort. Why? Because the nervous system mechanisms that we share with essentially all other animals, living beings, I mean, even down, for vertebrates definitely, but even down to non-vertebrates on a certain level. I mean, on a very significant level. Those things are all driven by what you might call Darwinian survival mechanisms. I mean, the whole, by evolution, whatever you want to talk about, the whole physical existence is geared towards, how do I get what I want? How do I survive? How do I fill my appetites? And it's kind of basically a uniquely human approach that has a lot to do with what meditation is, to modify those biological phenomena so that your attention is not totally driven by what do I want, what's going to fill my appetites, what are my desires right now. And to get beyond that, you basically take this third person perspective on first person experience and make other choices about what aspects of it you focus on, so you're not just driven by physical mechanisms.
What else is there? So if the brain and central nervous system is primarily passive, and there is this secret ingredient which is able to push back against that and direct attention, what is that if it's not neurophysiological? Is it super neurophysiological? I mean, is it other dimensional, or is it emergent? Is it an emergent?
That's why it's cutting against the grain of a fundamentalist religion, because it's not physical per se. So it does bring in a non-physical element to the choices that you make. But, and here's the big point, it takes a lot of effort to connect and receive the power of that non-physical capability to make other kinds of choices about how you attend to experience. It reminds
me of Gurdjieff. He sort of famously said that, you're born sort of subhuman and you have to work towards your humanity. It's through your work and effort in learning how to use your attention correctly that you become human, and humans are the kinds of things that can make decisions. And before that, you're a little bit automaton until you do that work. You're just banging around and satisfying desires, and you have to. So humanity is kind of hard won rather than just the gift of growing older, or just the gift of even being born.
That's putting a very positive connotation on the word human, and that's fine. But that's the whole point. If we want humans to be genuinely different from all the other living organisms in that we are aware of, that's right. We won't be unless we spend a lot of effort and training, and that effort and training is how do you train your attention to not be totally controlled by these physical aspects of your existence. Because your nervous system is really, it's not hard to understand in a linear way the relationship between physiology and action and attention. But then when you use when you reduce it, when you have a physicalist reductive perspective, and we won't start naming the names of the philosophers who represent that view. But one of them has famously called everything I'm talking about a folk story. This is just the folk story that regular, uneducated, ignorant people believe, because from that person's perspective, which has become a very mainstream view in academic, neuroscience, and not just neuroscience. Educated people know that, it's really just the physiological stuff that you can study, do experiments on, and that's going to explain everything about how your attention gets directed. So that makes everything your brain, and that's why I say you are not your brain.
Yeah.
It also sounds like then they need to make a philosophical distinction between the mind and the brain. Because when you say the mind can control brain chemistry, you're not saying the brain can control brain chemistry in this internal system. You're saying, no, something non-physical can have physical effects. And it sounds like in response to that point, they're kind of having to deny the existence of a mind independent, totally functionally independent of a brain.
Yeah, and I don't even want to have to say totally, because that gets into Gurdjieff and many others, and what you mean by human, and totally is a whole different department. I'm just looking for a little bit, right? We don't need totally here. We just need some, some, so that we're not fully determined. And that the other part of this is, if you don't spend the effort, and you don't do some mental training, and you don't have a belief that's consistent with realizing that you have choices to make about how you focus your attention, we will, in fact, be that. And if you don't, and that's another word, I was trying to bring the word effort into neuroscience. There's no room for the word effort in neuroscience. And that's why they never talk about it. there's no room for it. I mean, it's it's just some artificial thing that the anterior cingulate cortex looks like it's doing. You know, and we don't have to get into the the neuroanatomy and that, but yeah, I mean, that's what they reduce it to. It's just one little area of the brain kind of being a traffic cop. I mean, that's not effort. That's not what effort is. And so to have the word effort have a real meaning where you're actually pushing back and making some attempt to not just act in, animalistic, automaton type ways that are all determined by the physical mechanisms, always takes effort. And if you don't make that effort, you are going to be that animal-like automaton.
Is this
and you
where...
can live your whole life like that.
Is
and
this
that you
sort
want
of
to talk about habits, and habits have a lot to do with all of that.
Right. So even now that we're like getting onto habits and like the way that habits can have a life of their own and the effort to push back, I know you've done a lot of work with OCD as well. And is that where this fits into the overall sort of hermeneutic of your research?
Well, I mean, look, OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, I recognized, in the late 80s that obsessive compulsive disorder was a very good medical condition to study, to pursue these interests, which I've had, since quite long before that. I mean, into certain mid 70s. I mean, I just turned 71, so that can put some chronology on it. And obsessive compulsive disorder, which significantly is a physical, genetically inherited, so it is physical and it is genetically inherited, and it has to do with the relationship with a particular part of the cortex, and especially the very deep habit center, the striatum it's called, or in humans, for the front of the brain, the caudate nucleus is the part of the striatum that receives the input from the frontal cortex, and that part of the brain, it's part of a set of structures called the basal ganglia. But the striatum, which is part of the basal ganglia, is something we share not just with all reptiles, but also with all birds, and so it's a very primitive structure, and it runs things automatically. I mean, so OCD is. And that's why, my book that's primarily on obsessive compulsive disorder is called Brain Lock, because basically that striatum locks in aspects of the cortex, and you get very repetitive, intrusive, very hard to control. In fact, they're not really controllable. So you have this physical, intrusive, unwanted, bothersome urge to wash, to check, to do these very basic kind of behaviors, and you can't make those urges go away. I mean, the habit center is locked in on them and won't let them go, and there's literally like a broken gear shift. So then what we could train people to do, and yes, medications can help to sort of get the gear shift to work better again, but it's not just, if it's not going to just be medications, there are choices that you can make that take a huge amount of effort, which allow you to see, wait a second, I don't need to wash again. I don't even want to wash again. That this feeling, and that's where I came up with, you are not your brain, because your brain is making you deeply feel like it's an emergency. You have to wash again. You have to check again. But when you realize it doesn't make sense, you can resist it. And then we found that by actively resisting it and changing to another behavior, which takes a huge amount of effort, especially in the beginning, you can actually change the brain chemistry and metabolism associated with that broken gear shift in the brain.
But then an interesting question emerges, because while, as you say, OCD is largely physical and genetic, what explains why somebody might need to wash obsessively, where someone else might need to have things lined up on their desk? Like, there's a qualitative difference in people's OCDs. Yeah. And how is that explained in your mind?
Yeah, no, well, I mean, okay, so that can go two broad ways that are very consistent with one another. On the one hand, it's sort of what aspects of the gear shift mechanism aren't really working right, but there can also be some relationship between that and, kind of your early developmental psychological. So there is kind of that basic psychodynamic developmental aspect that's potentially part of it. The short answer is we don't really know why some people get the urge to wash and some people get the urge to check. There are observable brain differences, subtle, between people who wash, people who check. I mean, but why those changes are there in terms of developmental aspects, what you might call psychological aspects, as opposed to just genetic inherited aspects, we don't really know, and it's probably a combination of those two. But in the end, whether you get the urge to wash or check, and people basically almost always get both, but some are more prominent than others. And then there are also just intrusive, bothersome thoughts that things aren't right. And so a cardinal aspect of obsessive compulsive disorder is perfectionism, but it's a very gripping, malfunctional kinds of perfectionism where you get so caught up on everything being exactly right that you become malfunctional because it never feels right. And the reason why it never feels right is because the brain gears don't line up right, and that's due to a physical problem. So it's some combination of psychological development, but that's brain largely too.
You spoke there around putting in a lot of effort to help change that. Can you describe the process that somebody goes through to change it?
Nice.
Yeah, well, so I came up with this method called the 4 steps. And the 4 steps are relabel, reframe, refocus, and then revalue, which happens automatically and means your brain has changed because your values change after you. Okay, relabel is straight ahead mindfulness. And I took that term from the mindfulness, from the ancient Buddhist mindfulness tradition, and specifically an approach used by a great Buddhist Burmese teacher named Mahasi Sayadaw, who talked a lot about putting labels on your experience as an act of doing insight or vipassana meditation. So you put labels on, so I feel like I need to wash, I feel like I need to check, but it doesn't have to be just OCD, but and so you just, first of all, you start to get that outer perspective so that you're not just experiencing it, but you're using language to tell yourself and start to create a narrative that it's not, it's something that's happening to me. I'm getting this urge to wash. It ceases to be just an urge to wash and is understood as something that's happening to me. And then the reframing brings in even more strongly the brain and the cognitive therapy element of it, of, is this true? Does this thought make sense? Does this feeling make sense? So when you relabel and you reframe, you begin to take the third person perspective and use language to take the third person outer perspective, use the wise advocate that helps you sort of create an inner narrative and asks the question, does this make sense? Is this going in a good direction? Are good things going to happen if you keep doing this? I mean, so that, and then you reframe by basically say, this isn't true. That's basic cognitive therapy. It's a cognitive distortion, or what I like to call it, a deceptive brain message. So you relabel and then reframe, and then you're basically relabeling in the reframing by saying, this is just a deceptive brain message. My brain is tricking me. And then you can make another choice and do, and now we say, do another behavior, an adaptive behavior, and one that involves other good habits, like, say gardening, playing a musical instrument. I mean, good activities, work out. I mean, things that involve good habits. So, because then you can get the good part of your habit center to be working and use that, refocus on those behaviors. So you're using an effort to refocus your attention. And when
That's
you do
awesome.
that regularly, we found that the brain changes, and then your values change, and then you can go, oh, that's just that deceptive brain message. I'm going to refocus on something useful. And it all becomes much faster, and your brain actually changes, and that's what we discovered. The bad circuitry becomes milder. The problem areas of the brain calm down.
That's excellent. It makes a lot of sense. Jamie, if you don't have a follow-up there, just one thing I want to hit on the nose. You mentioned the wise advocate again, and maybe we could just talk a little bit about that in this context, because I know you have a very specific definition of that, and I know it's linked into your understanding of what mindfulness is, which I think is such an important message to be getting across, because today in the sort of mindfulness movement, I think we miss out on a lot of what mindfulness was originally supposed to mean. So maybe we could talk a little bit about the wise advocate here.
Okay, so the wise advocate actually is an inner loving guide, and actually, the word advocate I actually took as one of the main translations in a Christian context of a word that's used to describe the Holy Spirit.
Interesting.
The word advocate is a main translation of a Greek word called parakletos, which means call beside, that you can call beside, and in Christian understanding, it's the Holy Spirit to help you. So the wise advocate is your helper, comforter, advocate, counselor, encourager, strengthener, friend, consoler, guide. Those are all words that are used to translate this Greek word parakletos in various translations of the New Testament. And so I just chose advocate because it seemed very good. So you have an inner loving guide. So everyone, even if you leave aside the theological aspects of it, everyone seems to have a natural intuitive sense, and that's why we sometimes use Jiminy Cricket from, Pinocchio. It's like, you have the good one and the bad one, and Jiminy Cricket is like your helper whispering in your ear,
Sure.
Be your helper, your inner loving guide, so that's what the wise advocate is, your inner loving guide. And that's become, for me, like a synonym for a proper understanding of mindfulness, not as much in a Buddhist context, but it is that, it's helping you take the third person perspective on first person experience. And on top of that is helping you create a constructive narrative that takes moral, ethical aspects into consideration, and always is asking the question, and this is why we use it in business leadership training in my most recent book called The Wise Advocate, that, is this going where we want to go? I mean, focusing on goal-directed aspects of where you need to go. That takes a lot of effort. Consulting the Wise Advocate helps you do that. So you relabel, you say, my mind's being distracted, you reframe, they go, no, that's not going where we want to go. You're consulting you get into the habit of consulting your wise advocate and go, well, what do we need to focus on? You make a choice about, well, this behavior, let's do this training that's going to, lead to long-term benefits. Focus on that. That changes your brain. And, that focus changes the brain, which is what revalue means. Your brain has changed. You value it differently.
Where do you get this wise advocate? Is this something that you think just comes along hard-coded in human experience, or is this something you grow by doing ethical discipline over a number of years and through education?
I don't know to what degree you're aware of that. You're just like bridging, the two philosophical kind of perspectives, and you can bridge them. And I like that the term wise advocate is good for bridging in that way. And that's why, obviously a lot of people we're training are just secular. They might even be frankly atheists, but even they believe that there's something that, that you can consult to create a new narrative. But for me, the word is receptive. The wise advocate is something that you receive. And so that's obviously very consistent with meditative traditions, that you're training your attention to be more receptive. I mean, even like, let's use, again, Alcoholics Anonymous, the AA model, which dovetails with this extremely nicely, your higher power. I mean, how do you connect with your higher power more effectively when you want to have a drink, if you're an alcoholic? I mean, that's one very straight ahead way of understanding it. But yeah, I mean, if you want to make it, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, okay, because it definitely involves the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex.
Because that's what tells you what you're going to do over a lifetime, right? The dorsolateral
Exactly.
prefrontal cortex is temporally extended.
That's it. I mean, you're training your prefrontal cortex to get your habit center, your striatum to,
Right.
attend to this wise advocate perspective.
Right.
Be more
So
receptive to the wise advocate perspective.
So when you say receptive, I also hear like the Dzogchen tradition in Tibetan Buddhism, you already have these natural perfections. They're already part of you. What you basically have to do is you just have to let go of the hindrances that are between your wisdom and where you are now. And then your wisdom shines forth in a way. You become wiser by getting calmer and by getting the right perspective and by getting your ducks in a row. And then your wisdom is able to sort of help direct. So if you can be quiet enough, you become wise in a way. I mean, you're not the only person saying that. You find that.
To a Socratic. That's interestingly, very, related and quite a bit later than Socrates, who said something very, very similar to that. And then the person who I really love is Søren Kierkegaard, who really likes to integrate the Socratic and Christian perspective. That's what he was all about, is integrating the Socratic. And because what you just said, Mark, is basically the Socratic perspective, that you have an inner truth. You're trying to remember the inner truth within you. That's what Socrates was murdered, forced to drink hemlock because he was teaching this to the Athenian youth. That was like not a good thing from their perspective. So you see, it's a long story that has this repetitive theme in it in human history, as it were. I mean, but Socrates very much believed that you have this truth inside of you that you're trying to reconnect with. Remember was his way of putting it.
And what did Kierkegaard do in addition to that? I mean, I don't know. I think it's so fascinating now we're talking about Kierkegaard. I'd like to talk about that a little more. What did Kierkegaard do to synthesize?
Kierkegaard did a huge amount in addition to that because, again, Mark's because from a Christian perspective, that is just not the way we understand how human beings are. I mean, Kierkegaard very much, because he was, very much, a very orthodox kind of Christian belief. I mean, he added, a lot into it in terms of bringing the whole notion of choice and decision making. He stressed that, the whole issue. But you have to choose to overcome what, from a Christian perspective, is original sin. I mean, you have a sin nature that you don't want to just go inside of yourself, because inside of yourself, just as yourself, is just this animal nature. I mean, pride and desire and lust and ill will, and I mean, and that's why you need to receive, within that way of thinking, you need to receive the input of what we call the wise advocate, which he very much called God, I mean, and Christ. I mean, you need help. You need, he didn't actually speak about the Holy Spirit that much. He definitely spoke about it, but he made it more kind of about Jesus helping you, which is obviously hot, because it's Jesus who's, sending the Holy Spirit. That's why he was crucified. I mean, a lot of this comes down, Mark, to like asking the question, so why did Jesus need to be crucified? and if unless there's something that needs to be atoned for, and a lot of atheists will go, see, Christianity is ridiculous. What kind of a belief, takes their God and nails them to a cross? Well, the answer to that is one who believes he's going to overcome that and pay the price that needs to be paid for, for atoning for the way we are. So, these are different perspectives on these issues. But Kierkegaard loved to bring the Socratic issue into that, he loved the questioning attitude that Socrates had, that you're always asking and the humility, knowing that you don't know, was Socrates and Kierkegaard. And then you have to make choices in light of knowing that you don't know.
Jeffrey, where can everybody find you online?
Okay, well, I have a website. It's jeffreymschwartz.com. So just jeffreymschwartz.com. But there's also our we have a website for the book and a leadership training program that we've started called The Wise Advocate, and that is wisepod.com. ADVOC, the number 8. So it's wiseadvocate.com. So JeffreyMSchwartz.com and WISEADVOC, the number 8.com. It will get you right in. And especially if you're sort of a high, more adaptive and want to use this, because, this all started to have people with a bad disease get their functionality back. Now, half a century later, we're trying to apply this method to take high functioning people and make them even more high functioning. And that's what the Wise Advocate is about.
Jeffrey, thank you so much for joining us.
Good. No, it was very good. No, you're welcome. And thanks for having me, and and thanks for doing this kind of work and being interested, because I wish there were like more academically oriented people who would be beginning to, and I think there are. It's coming along. So there is definitely more of a note of optimism in me now than there was a couple of years ago about these kinds of questions, in terms of them really getting traction in the world of academic neuroscience and neuropsychiatry.
Brilliant. Well, that was the Contemplative Science podcast. That was Dr. Jeffrey M. Schwartz, and as always, we will see you next week.